It's really wonderful to be here, and Bree, thank you. I think I'd like to take you back to Seattle because you're a meteorologist and maybe you can make the weather better. It's been raining for 3 weeks or so, and I remember the last time in Seattle that we had long days of rain, about 3 weeks of rain, I think. My producer from Morning Edition called, and she said, Nancy, here in Washington, we understand it's been raining a lot in Seattle. How about coming on the show and talking to Steve Inskeep about the books that you've been reading while it's been raining? So I said, oh, what a great idea. I talked to Steve on the phone. We do it over an ISDN line. And I finished talking about the books, and then I said, still on the air, still talking to Steve, I said, oh my God, those books are all so depressing. But I think Bree's idea of texting your favorite book along with your donation is a great idea, and I always love to hear what people are reading. I'm going to talk to you today, not so much as a writer, although I have to say, the books that I've written, including my 2017 novel, George and Lizzie, were just really very special to me to do. But I want to talk to you today as a reader, because I believe that literacy, the joy of reading, is really basic. It's really a human right. And when I grew up in Detroit, Michigan. I grew up in a lower class neighborhood in a family that, we didn't have any money. I didn't own books. But even worse than that, it was a family that was particularly unhappy, each in its own way, each member in its own way. Nowadays, we would, of course, call that a dysfunctional family. Back then, I just knew that I was just miserably unhappy and didn't want to be at that house. And so, consequently, I spent every day that I could, and every moment of every day that I could, at my local library. And my local library in Detroit was the Parkman Branch Library. I would go there every day after school. I would come home, I would drop off my books, and I would walk the 2 miles or ride my trusty bike Charger. It was a Huffy bicycle. Some of you might remember that brand, and I named it Charger. I would ride that to the library. I would go early every Saturday morning. I would pack a lunch. I would take that lunch, and Charger and I would make our way to the library. I would be at the library when the doors opened at 9 o'clock, and I would still be there at 5 o'clock on Saturdays when the library closed. The library for me was a place of not only safety and quiet, but it was a place where I was loved. And the people who loved me at the library were my children's librarians. And I call them my children's librarians. I call it my library because that's how I felt. And my 2 librarians, Miss Long and Miss Whitehead, especially Miss Whitehead, took this miserably unhappy child that I was and gave me the world. And how did she do that? She gave me the world because she gave me books to read. She opened the world to me, and that's what reading does. She created, and I really think she molded me to become someone who believes that empathy is one of the most important characteristics that we can develop. And the way she taught me empathy was through giving me books about people, children who were different from me. Now, I lived in Detroit. There were not a lot of migrant workers in Detroit. But she gave me a book by Lois Lenski called Strawberry Girl, about a little girl whose family follows the strawberry harvest. And I learned from that book what that kind of life was like. Miss Whitehead, because she was Canadian, she gave me to read all of those wonderful, wonderful children's books, British children's books, the E. Nesbit books, The Railway Children, 5 Children in It, The Hobbit, all of the Narnia books. It was just an amazing time for me to be in Miss Whitehead's, to be her friend. And really, I looked on her as a mentor, but more than that, almost as a substitute mother. And I remember one time when Miss Whitehead met me, I have to say, I was about 8 or 9, and all I read, and some of you I know will identify with this, all I read when I was 8 or 9 were horse and dog books. Do you remember that period? I can still tell you my favorite horse book is called Tick-Tock and Jim. And of all the Black Stallion books, Black Stallion and Satan is the best one. Go get it now. And my favorite dog book is a book called Bonnie's Boy. I love that book so much. That library, if you came with me to Detroit and we went to that library, I could take you in the children's section to where those horse and dog books were. So that's all I read. And one day, Miss Whitehead said to me, "Nancy, would you like to be the first person in this library to read this new horse book by Marguerite Henry?" Oh my God, of course I would. So I held out my hands like this, Miss Whitehead, yes, you offered the book. And in the first really example of bait and switch that I ever have come up against, Miss Whitehead said, "I will give you Sea Star of Chincoteague, and you will be the first person in this library to be able to read that book. But first, I want you to read this other book called Mary Poppins." And that way, little by little, Miss Whitehead weaned me away from those horse and dog books into reading a much wider world of literature. At that library in Detroit at that time, you had to be 13 or in the 9th grade to be able to go over to the adult section. And to get to the adult section, it wasn't a Carnegie library, but it was like a Carnegie library where you climb upstairs to enter. Why all Carnegie libraries have stairs is because Carnegie believed that you ascended to knowledge. And that walking up the stairs to go to the library is a metaphor for that sort of belief. So at the Parkman Library, you walked up the stairs, and then in front of you was the circ desk, and to the right were the children's books, and to the left were the adult books. And Miss Whitehead, when I turned 13, I very proudly came in and I said, "Miss Whitehead, now I'm 13. She said, "I know you are, and I'm going to take you over to the adult section." She walked me over to the adult section of the library. She introduced me to the librarians there, and she let me loose. Now, she wasn't thrilled that I was leaving the children's section, not because she didn't think I should read those books. There was nothing like that. But she knew there were still so many children's books that she wanted me to read, that I now would be less inclined because here were the adult books. And the first grown-up book that I checked out was Gone with the Wind. Oh my goodness, was I in a state reading that book. Wow, that was really wonderful. So I knew when I was 10 years old that I wanted to be a children's librarian. I knew that I wanted to give back to other children, or to give to other children what Miss Whitehead had given me. And I did become a children's librarian, and I have to say my career has taken many interesting twists and turns, all pretty remarkably wonderful, including an action figure or 2 or 3. This is the 3rd iteration of the action figure that Archie McPhee, some of you might know that company, Accoutrements. So when, my library, my public library, was so important to me as a child that I still find myself dreaming about it. You know, that whatever else is happening in my dream, it seems to be happening in that library. And I really thought that that was perfectly normal. You know, doesn't everybody dream about their childhood libraries? I mean, of course. But then I learned one day at a breakfast very much like this, that was not the case. And I want to just tell you about that. So my last job at the Seattle Public Library was supervising the wonderful librarians who did the programming for the adults and the children's programming. And every year there's a summer reading program for kids, and at the end of the summer reading program, there's a breakfast. So one child from each branch comes to this breakfast with their parents or their guardians or the adult in their life. And I had to be there. Now, I am not someone who's comfortable being out of my house. I'm much happier sitting in my house reading or writing, or, you know, I have no small talk whatsoever. All I can ever talk about is books, and, you know, sometimes that comes up, but mostly when I have nothing to say, what I say is, so what have you been reading? And then I learn a lot. So I'm not comfortable I'm not a good person at parties, I have to say, to admit that. So I didn't want to go to this breakfast, but I had to go because these were my staff doing the breakfast. And so I got there, they showed me where I was supposed to sit. It was a table for 8. When I came in, there were 3 men already at the table, and they showed me where to sit. So I was like sitting right there. On my left was one of the deputy mayors of Seattle. On my right was one of those wonderful library foundation members, someone who was, you know, very generous to the library. He was also tan 12 months a year. And he wore those loafers with tassels, you know, those very shiny loafers with tassels. Now, if I had anything to say to him, I was struck dumb in the face of those loafers. So he was on my right. Right across from me was one of the newscasters from one of the television stations in Seattle. So when I get, you know, nervous, I kind of move around a lot in my seat. And, you know, the first thing I said, they weren't talking, the guys weren't talking. So the first thing I said was, of course, so what's everybody reading? Well, that conversation ended in, I don't know, 10 seconds. The guy on my left, deputy mayor, the Da Vinci Code. The guy on my right, tan loafers, the Da Vinci Code. The guy across from me, newscaster, the Da Vinci Code. So then silence fell again, and nobody was saying anything. And I was getting, you know, like I was fidgeting around in my chair, and I happened to look down, and my napkin, which had been on my lap, had disappeared. And I thought, oh gosh, it's underneath the table. It's probably flown underneath the table somehow. I have to get it. So I very carefully lifted up the table skirt and sort of peered under the table, and my napkin was like halfway under that table. I have no idea how it got there. I won't say I crawled under the table, but I did retrieve my napkin, and I sat up. But while I was underneath the table, I noticed that the man who was sitting across from me, the newscaster, was wearing cowboy boots. Now, I spent many, many years in Oklahoma, so I do pride myself on my knowledge and appreciation for cowboy boots. So I sat up and I said, oh wow, great boots. And he said, oh, do you know why I wear them? And I said, no, why? And he said, because I don't have to match my socks. Now, I should have asked him I should have asked him at that point, did he mean he didn't have to match his socks as they came out of the dryer? Now that is ideal to me. You know, you just take your whole bunch of socks and just dump them in a drawer and pull out 2 socks. Or did he mean, and this is, I'm afraid, what I think he did really mean, that he didn't have to match them to his suits because he was wearing these cowboy boots. But I didn't ask him those questions because I was thrilled by the level of repartee that we had achieved. And then silence fell again. And I thought, I was like at my wit's end. And finally, I said, you know, I dream about my childhood public library fairly frequently. And the man who was sitting to my right, you remember him, tan loafers, shiny loafers, turned to me with horror on his face. Now, if you sometimes feel like, if you've ever asked yourself, as I know many of you have, if someone looks at me with horror, will I recognize it as such? Let me tell you, there is no doubt you will. It is unmistakable. He looked at me with horror and he said, just like this, he said, "Oh my God, Nancy, get a life." And I wanted to say to him, but I didn't because, I worked for the library and he was a very generous donor to the Library Foundation, and I do have a little bit of sense. I wanted to say to him, in this world, we have one life, but through books and reading, we can have any number of lives. We can go anywhere, we can do anything, and we can be anyone. And I have to say, I knew that was true when I was 10 years old, and I know that it's true today. And I know all of you know how true that is. Otherwise, you wouldn't be here at this wonderful luncheon that is in support of such a wonderful organization, the Learning Lab. My father did not graduate from high school until he was in his 70s. In his 70s, after he retired from a not very well-paying job, he went to a literacy organization in Detroit and got his GED. And he was so proud. I remember that he told me that he brought an apple for his teacher, after he took the test and passed his GED. So when I left the library in 2004, when I left the Seattle Public Library, one of the things that I was proudest of at the library was the program that we called then If All Seattle Read the Same Book. What a clunky name. Now it's called Seattle Reads, and of course it's been replicated at libraries all over the world. And I just wanted really, really briefly to tell you about an experience which I think shows how important reading is and how important discussion is in making our world a better place. I was invited to Bosnia, and many of you know the history of Bosnia, and you know that it was part of Yugoslavia when Yugoslavia broke up after the death of Tito. And Croatia and other areas in other former states in Yugoslavia declared their independence. Bosnia's government voted to declare their independence, and the Serbs from Serbia attacked Bosnia. And there was the longest siege in human history in Sarajevo. It was a horrible war. It was a horrible war full of just, you must read about. I mean, it's a terrible stain in human history, the war in Bosnia. And basically, there are three groups in Bosnia: the Serbs, the Croats, and the Muslims. And the result of ending the war in Bosnia was to divide Bosnia up into two distinct sections: Srpska, which is where the Serbs are primary, and the rest of Bosnia. So the Serbs don't recognize Sarajevo as the capital. There's two library associations in Bosnia, the Serbian Library Association and the Bosnian Library Association. But even more than that, kids are growing up, it's like apartheid. Kids are growing up not knowing anybody but people who are like them. And this wonderful cultural affairs officer at the US Embassy decided that what she needed to make happen was if all Bosnia's kids read the same book. And the book she chose was Sherman Alexi's The Absolutely True Diary of a Part-Time Indian. And when she told me that was the name of the book that they were all going to read, that was the book they were all going to read, I thought, well, what are Bosnian kids going to, how can they identify with that book at all? The main character, Arnold, growing up on this Spokane Indian reservation, it just didn't seem sensible. But was I wrong, and was she ever right? But she brought me in to teach teachers and librarians there how to lead book discussions for these kids about this book. And the first day that I was doing the program, teaching these, we had a big group, and I was talking to them about books and how to get discussion going. And one of the things in the Part-Time Diary, that book by Sherman Alexie, is at the end of the book, there's a list of, Arnold talks about all the different groups that he's in. So he's a Spokane Indian, he's a cartoonist, he's a 15-year-old masturbator, all of those different things. He makes a list of the different tribes that he belongs to. He's a Spokane Indian. And so I said, let's go around the room and talk about, let's each say a tribe that we belong to, a group that we belong to. And, I started with the first person, and she said, I'm the daughter of a Muslim mother and a Serbian father. And there was a gasp from the back of the room, and somebody said, I'm in that tribe too. And even telling you this, this has been 5 years, that connection, because of a book, is so powerful. So if that can happen in Bosnia, if it can bring those kids together, which we did, it was amazing, it can happen here. But I just want to end on a lighter note, which is, I talked about the pleasures of reading, which are so many and so deep and so worth supporting. But I want to tell you just very briefly about the perils of a life of reading. I've had a life of reading. Here are the perils that I've discovered. One of the perils of a life of reading is that you never know how to pronounce anything, right? Because you've discovered how to pronounce them from a book that you've read. So I, for years, thought it was when things went badly, they went awry, right? My favorite, though, is I always thought when someone gave you the wrong information, they had mizzled you. Now, someone said to me, mizzled, that's not right, it's misled. But what I've come to recognize is that it's mizzled north of the Mason-Dixon line and misled south of the Mason-Dixon line. And there are some foolish people who persist in thinking that it's misled. Wrong. So that's one peril. A second peril of a life of reading is that, I don't know about you, but if I encounter a word in a book that I'm not exactly sure what it means, I think, I'm too lazy, I don't get up. If I'm on my Kindle, I usually don't have my Kindle turned on, so I can't even, look it up that way. And I think, I can get it from the context. Well, that's wrong. You cannot get words from the context reliably. I remember reading Anne of Green Gables, and my favorite book in that series is Anne of the Island. And in that book, you might remember, Anne comes back. She's in college. She comes back to say goodbye to her friend Ruby Gillis, who is dying. And that's a very sad scene in that book, I have to tell you. Anne goes to see Ruby, and Ruby, she's always been jealous of Ruby because Ruby is, has very pale, alabaster white skin and beautiful hair, and Anne, of course, is freckled and has all that red hair. And there's Ruby lying in her bed. What's going to be her deathbed? And Anne goes to say goodbye to her. And I'm reading the book, and I'm just weeping. And Anne says goodbye to Ruby and leaves. And Anne knows, and I knew, she's never going to see Ruby on this earth again. And then there's a line in the book, and it says, and that night, Ruby died of consumption. And I thought, well, who ate her? So I do have to urge you. I do have to urge you to look words up and not do that. Okay, but the worst peril of a life of reading, and this is one, the other two were like jokes, but this is really serious. I mean, the other two happened, but this is really, really serious. And I want you to promise me that not only are you going to donate to Learning Lab, but you are going to take these words to heart. When you are a reader, you never know for sure if your memories are really your memories, or if you have borrowed them from a book that you've read. Now, I want to give you a very quick example of that. My youngest daughter, Katie, and I are very close, and we still talk a lot on the phone about only very important things like what she's reading and what I'm reading. And one day I was talking to her, and I said, Katie, did I ever tell you about the dress I wore to my senior prom in high school? And she said, you went to your senior prom? And I mean, that's a very snippy thing for a kid to say to her mother. I said, yes, I went to my senior prom. I went with Mike. And Katie said, oh, wow. Well, what was your dress like? I said, oh, Katie, it was absolutely beautiful. I said, it was very pale green, and it had a peplum bodice. And Katie said, oh, peplum bodice? What's peplum? Well, that was a word I had never looked up. So I said, I didn't want to lie to her. I said, I'm not exactly sure, but I think it has something to do with pipe cleaners, which is what I actually thought. And Katie said, oh, pale green, a peplum bodice. She said, what was the skirt like? I said, oh, it was just beautiful. It was a tulle skirt. And Katie, and now in years past, I would have said it was a Tully skirt, of course, and that I was the belly of the ball, no doubt. But I said it was a tulle skirt. It was a tulle skirt and a peplum bodice, very pale green. So Katie said nothing to me on the phone. There was silence on the phone. And the silence lasted a long time, so long that, I thought that we had been disconnected. So I screamed into the phone, Katie, are you there? And Katie said in this voice, exactly the kind of voice you want your adult children to talk to you in. She said, oh, Mommy. She still calls me Mommy. I think that's sweet. She said, oh, Mommy, I'm afraid that wasn't your dress. I said, what? It wasn't my dress? Well, whose dress was it? She said, well, if I'm not mistaken, it was Penny Howard's dress in Double Date by Rosamond Dujardin. Now, I have to admit to you that I own the book Double Date, which I got from a library book sale, and I went to my bookshelves and I read that book. And not only, I read Double Date, then I read the sequel, Double Feature. It's about twins. Pam wore the same dress in yellow, I discovered. after double feature comes double wedding, after they break up a little bit in whatever, I don't remember. Now, I read all those books. Not only was Katie right, that was Penny's dress in that book, but she went to the senior prom with Mike, who she later married in double wedding. Now, I know that I didn't marry Mike. I mean, I know who I married. But I have to say, aside from that, all my memories, I don't trust them anymore. But if that's the worst thing that can happen from a life of reading, I say, let's read on. Thank you.